Good afternoon and welcome to an informational briefing of the Senate and House Committees on Housing. From the Senate Committee on Housing, we have myself, Stanley Chang, as the chair, and we have two new friends from the House Committee on Housing, Acting Chair Gregory Alagon and Acting Vice Chair Tyson Miyake. And we're here today to learn from Smart Growth America's latest 2024 report, Affordable Housing in Hawaii, Inventory and Strategies, followed by a presentation from HHFDC, and then followed by questions. So from Smart Growth America, we have Michael Rodriguez, who's all the way from
Washington, D.C.
Thank you so much for coming to Hawaii and joining us.
Thanks. I've enjoyed it very much. I have a written statement that, if it's okay, please. So thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Chang and other members of the committee, the Hawaii State Senate Committee on Housing and the House side as well. I thank the chairman for his invitation to be here today to discuss the serious issue of affordable housing and Smart Growth America approaches to addressing the housing crisis. I also thank the AARP and my colleagues at their Hawaii State Office for being our partner in this research. I'm Michael Rodriguez, Director of Research at Smart Growth America, a 501c3 nonprofit in Washington, D.C. Wherever we do work or provide research, we do so as we envision a country where no matter where you live or who you are, you can enjoy living in a place that is healthy, prosperous, and resilient. Now, one of Hawaii's current threats to the prosperity and well-being of its residents is that people across the income spectrum find it challenging to afford housing. Whether rental housing or owning their own home, housing costs have really burdened local families. Our recent research on affordable housing programs in Hawaii highlights this issue. If you are a prospective homeowner, you face the costliest housing market in any state with a median home value north of $750,000. That's almost 2.5 times the median home price in the country. Barely a third of Hawaiian residents can afford that. If you'd like to rent, the market rent for a 2-bedroom home in this state is nearly $2,000 a month, again, the costliest in the nation. To afford this, a family must earn over $80,000 to $90,000 a year to not be cost burdened beyond 30%. These costs lead many Hawaii residents and many native Hawaiian families to unfortunately pack their belongings and move to other states. Hawaii had lost almost 42,000 residents since 2020 in net domestic migration. How many of those families could simply no longer to afford Hawaii's increasing cost of housing? To address the issues of high housing costs, states often implement affordable housing programs. Unfortunately, Hawaii's stock of affordable units is dwindling. Our research, which I'll present today, identifies about 14,700 subsidized homes across the state, which amounts to less than 3% of the state's total housing stock of about 557,000 homes. Now, of those subsidized homes, 57% are supported directly by state funding, and 43% of them with some manner of federal funds. Some include a mix of both. In fact, many include a mix of both. Unfortunately, without action, Hawaii is at risk of losing over 11,600 of those units, nearly 80%, by 2045 as the term of the unit subsidy expire. Expiration means that the building or unit would no longer have an affordability requirement, and these units may convert to market rate. This loss would significantly impact the thousands of Hawaii residents who rely on government programs to find a place they can afford to call home, and many of them will be at risk of being unhoused. Of course, we recognize that many of these affordable units may renew with new programs or that owners may commit to longer-term affordability independently. Nonetheless, this timeline of dwindling affordable units underscores the severity of the problem if the state, local government, and property owners take no action. Smart Growth America offers several approaches that may help. First, we stress that location matters, especially regarding infrastructure and access to opportunities. Everything from walkability, complete streets, and transit matter to families. We shouldn't forget that housing plus transportation is the most significant factor in overall the cost of living. The state should consider encouraging affordable housing along infrastructure like the Honolulu Skyline Light Rail and new corridors reimagined as complete streets planned in Honolulu. Transit-oriented development around rail infrastructure allows the opportunity to capture publicly created value using tools like tax increment financing or TIF. Those funds in turn can support affordable housing where workers can link to transit and improve their access to jobs and amenities without relying on car ownership. Secondly, addressing affordability means using many public policy tools available, including regulation and innovative finance and construction strategies. Local governments would be wise to consider new zoning reforms since restrictive zoning can create exclusion and increase costs. On that point, I highlight the history of zoning and how it has been used to perpetuate exclusion, segregate Native people and people of color, and lead to problematic land use patterns and a lack of so-called missing middle housing. Beyond zoning, public land audits can help local governments understand how much they actually own and how those lands can be deployed to provide for affordable housing. From inclusionary zoning set-asides to tenant protections via rights of first refusal for apartment conversions, context-sensitive solutions can deliver for more for those who need it. The crux of the matter today is to ensure the preservation of affordability, particularly in the currently subsidized units. This preservation approach involves the maintenance of traditional public housing owned by the Hawaii Public Housing Authority, whose most recent building dates back to 1971. The key here is to invest in this housing to prevent it from deteriorating and becoming functionally obsolete. In some cases, innovative approaches such as public-private partnerships may be necessary, as exemplified by the proposed Kale Momi redevelopment project in Honolulu that aims to develop almost 11,000 affordable homes. Preserving also means leveraging all the federal programs through sufficient state funding that creates additional housing. Sometimes affordability can be preserved through mere educational programs that target property owners with technical assistance that helps them extend affordability timeframes or be more amenable to families using vouchers. Other times, preservation means more direct involvement. The forthcoming loss of units is partly due to a wave of building that happened in the 1960s through the 1990s. The state rode that wave of housing for a few decades, but unfortunately, it's now just treading water with insufficient funding. Yes, many of these programs, like the Hawaii Rental Housing Trust Fund and the Rental Housing Revolving Fund, require continued state support, but inaction may lead to more Hawaii residents drowning in housing costs within a decade or two. We also recognize that the impacts of climate change are putting more and more Hawaii residents in harm's way, with the cost of climate adaptation representing yet another barrier to affordable housing. People are not only at risk in the face of increasingly severe and intense storms, dangerous wildfires, and other hazards, they also likely face yet more housing costs. Insurance, retrofits, and investments in preparedness can increase burdens on families without added policies to address climate action. So to conclude, the path forward for Hawaii in addressing the housing crisis not only lies in the hands of policymakers and developers, but in the collective embrace of innovative, smart growth strategies that honor the spirit of the islands. By weaving together the threads of community, sustainability, and inclusivity, Hawaii can construct a tapestry of housing solutions that not only meet the urgent needs of today, but also lay the foundation for a future where every resident can find solace and stability in their own home. We would all hope that the state will move forward with resolve to build not just houses, but homes enriched with your state's aloha spirit, where every individual, regardless of their income, can thrive in harmony with the land and each other. Smart Growth America stands to support your beautiful state and to help in many ways and in any way we can to turn the tide of the crisis as Hawaii moves forward to usher in a new era of housing prosperity that mirrors the beauty and resilience of Hawaii itself. So thank you. With that, I'll get to the presentation. We can probably skip some of the portions of it. I'd like to introduce Smart Growth America a little more formally. Us being a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., we offer our help through an impact model of technical assistance and thought leadership, as well as advocacy. We do this around the country with our mission to ensure that people live with livable places and shared prosperity. And we do this through programmatic priorities where climate change, resilience, racial equity, and healthy communities matter through a lens of everything that we work on. And our senior housing team includes myself, my Vice President for Land Use and Development, Assistant Vice President Jerry Minster, And this is just part of our team. I thank all the team at Smart Growth America who's helped put together this report. So we talked about the state housing facts. I think I mentioned some of these. It's expensive in this state to own a home. You know this. I don't think I'm telling you anything that you probably haven't heard before, but it was important to put some numbers on this, especially when we talk about the other problem that causes, that comes a bit downstream from housing, homelessness, and the number of unhoused individuals in the state is no surprise a housing problem. So 41 in 10,000 residents are unhoused in this state. That's the fourth highest, and that comes because as housing costs increase, that risk increases as well. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. We've seen the number of the affordability of units and the availability of units increase in terms of median home prices. This is from HOU-Housing. I think this just follows the trends that you've heard all around the state. So I want to focus a bit more. We have a bit of a few slides here where we're talking about the specific programs that we fall under. I'm going to kind of just go through this. These are on background in your briefing, but just so that we know every one of the programs, when we say FHA, it means several programs that lie under what we would call FHA. Similarly with Section 8, this is not the voucher program that most people think of Section 8. It's a lot of other programs that are within what we call overall federal Section 8. So that's the background on this so that we know what we're talking about when we mention this inventory. 14,747 units, that's as of 2022, according to the National Housing Preservation Database that we developed this from. And no surprise to most people, most of these units, the vast majority, are in the county and city of Honolulu on Oahu, and the remainder in the neighboring islands. By number of subsidies, this gets a little complicated, but not too much. Any one unit can have more than one subsidy. In fact, most and many do have more than one subsidy attached. So adding that up gets you more than 14,000. So there's about 33,000 subsidies out there, and they're all kind of inside 14,000 units throughout the state or so. And this is how that splits up. The vast majority of them, or excuse me, the largest number of them are state level subsidies. Then you have LIHTC, public housing, which is its own variant of state housing. That's the direct housing afforded, and then a lot of the other programs throughout. A side note on affordable housing, because this is a very different type of housing, the units are rather old. The last unit that was built was in 1971. The oldest was in 1952. So that's just something to keep in mind when we talk about preservation and keeping state of good repair in current affordable housing units. And a different way of thinking about this is which specific program down into some of the number of units rather than the share of subsidies. So just a different way of looking at it. State units, we see Section 8 being a little higher by this measure, and so on. But I think this is really the one that we're focused a bit more on. We charted here the number of units. So what we're seeing here is, I like to compare this a little bit to a sink. You have an inflow, an outflow, and a water level. So if it's at equilibrium, the outflow equals the inflow. We unfortunately can't observe the inflow. And that's because for a long period, let's say 50 years we have here, there's not really a developer that can tell you what they're going to develop in 2050. Maybe for 5 years we can see the inflow, but we can observe the outflow because we know what the expirations are. So this is a situation where you kind of see the water level, you know what the outflow is on that drain, but we don't necessarily know what the inflow is. We would hope that that's coming and that is non-zero, that the state would be supporting that, but we don't witness it in the data in the same way. Maybe within a 5-year period that would require further study. But what this means is in that do-nothing scenario, so the faucet's broken, you only have outflow, you're down to about 68% loss by 2065 unless that inflow comes in and replaces it, at least to keep the water level. You would hope that you're actually increasing that level, increasing that stock. Down to the specific programs, you're looking at by 2045, a big number in that year, the 2041, 2045, when we talked about that, I talked about that wave that happened. There's a lot of units that were delivered in this 2000 to pre-financial crisis period. And that's because this is not necessarily much surprise. affordable housing construction follows the overall housing market. So as there's a lot of construction generally, you're gonna also see more construction in the affordable, especially because the way the systems are engineered, that affordable housing in this country by and large today is under a paradigm of semi-private and public-private partnerships like LIHTC. So a lot of that construction happened pre-financial crisis, 80s, 90s. That bill starts coming due. So that wave, the echo effect of that, we see that reflected in this 2030, 2041 period. And because of these we'll call it 30-year or 45-year expiration dates. I want to note that not everything on here is something that's within the purview of the states. A lot of these are just federal funds. So our friends at the state level here at HHFDC, they're tracking maybe some other of the subsidies, only a subset of this. This looks at the whole picture, including a lot of the federal stuff. So when we look at that, this is the severity of the affordable housing problem in the long term that we'd like to stress. It's pretty important, and that cliff coming in 2041, something to really know and hopefully to get ahead of. Zooming in a little bit, sorry, I should have just focused on this one. This helps us zoom in a little bit, see that 5,000 unit loss in that 2041-45 time period. We see, again, a lot of the state funding and the LIHTC funding coming at expiration. There's a lot of reasons, I do want to make a point, there's a lot of reasons that some units will not completely expire in terms of they won't go dark in affordability. A unit can lose all its expirations, but because of deed restrictions that perhaps the state has underneath it on a lease from state land per se, or just the charitability of the landowner themselves, you can arrive at that 2045 period. And many of those units, in fact, may just voluntarily continue to be affordable. However, funding is still necessary to keep them in a state of good repair. When we look at the major owners, I don't want to dwell too much, but to stress really the point that there's about 26 unique owners of affordable housing in the state that own about half of the units. So the curve, I showed the curve here a little bit, and this is who the owners are. It's in your brief here. We could talk about this. But looking here at this point, when we see this 50% mark, that's that 20-some number of owners. That's to say there's a big chunk at the front end and a long tail at the other end that you kind of see illustrated here. So when we talk about the vast majority of units, you could actually focus in on a couple of these large owners. It's going to get you to a 50% mark, and then that second 50% is a much larger number of actual owners throughout the state. Breaking it down by the type of owners, almost half are indeed private entities. That includes individuals, limited development, limited partners, and profits motivated, I should say. And not that nonprofit group is this little 25%, 1/4 of it, and public housing 24%. So this is important. Only about a quarter is actually nonprofit. You're getting half of the affordability in this state, and this probably isn't just by background research of my knowledge, this isn't really out of balance with probably what you might see at a national level or compared to other states. Very common that the private sector, because of the incentives and the federal and state housing policy regime that we have, that's going to be the biggest chunk of this subsidized affordability that exists. And lastly, on another caveat, we don't see naturally occurring affordable housing. That's not what we're talking about here. I'd like to mention it, but this only looks at the subsidized units. And just on the mapping, I think I don't want to dwell too much, but we came up with some great maps for the record that's I'm aware on the website and in your briefings. We see most of the units, no surprise, following where the population is. Most of the units are in Oahu, focused down towards Waikiki and on the southern shore. And specifically, I want to make one point about Lahaina and Maui, that we're not aware, or excuse me, I'm not aware of the current status of some of the units, unfortunately, but we do know, and we did count, that within the disaster zone in that county and in the community in Lahaina, there were about 276 units that we could identify that likely could have been at risk. I'm not aware of the current status, but that's what it was. As we look forward to disaster relief funds and other types of state funds that could go towards that, I think that's a very important priority just in terms of replacement, and really from a moral perspective. A lot of these were senior units, and units set aside for individuals with disabilities. And this is, again, a map of Maui where those units, Hawaii and Big Island. This generally comes to no surprise. Affordability follows population trends in some of the hotspots. But I want to talk about actually get towards some of these solutions. So I'm skipping forward a bit towards the overall affordability toolkit. This toolkit actually comes from HUD. So there's 6 overall policy tools, and I kind of put them in my policy framework that I think about. Any policy that yourself, Senator, or any of the members of the state legislature can come up with, this general, any policy falls under a mandate, an incentive, or a disincentive. And it's very important to really think about where in those buckets the any one policy can land. So in one bucket over here, there's preserving affordability, but that falls under various of these buckets. So you can have actual just mandates where you're requiring, for example, set asides. That's usually at the local level. There's subsidies, your incentives, and so on. There's a model where the nonprofits lead this more. So you could lean on nonprofit development. We've spoken with Catholic Charities, who does a lot of great work in this state. That's one model of building your affordability. The other one is thinking through other ownership programs. This is a manner of affordability where you're looking at individuals, not necessarily renters, but trying to get individuals to become homeowners in affordable units for them. And that often involves favorable lending, things like what FHA does and equivalents at the state level, income-based subsidies, and so on. There's that number 4. Number 4 there is actually what a lot of the funds from the federal government and from the state government following the federal lead fall under. So I would actually characterize that a lot of the current housing policy falls in number 2 and number 4, partly because that's what the data tells us. Again, almost half of the units that are subsidized affordable in this state are indeed that number 4, that they're market rate led. And they're using the private sector in there. And then down here, there's through number 6, this is that mandate portion. At the most severe end of policy tools available to you, there then again is these tools. And I'm not characterizing any of these in terms of advocating for necessarily for or against, or saying that right now that I think rent controls goes one or the other, but these are to show the tools that are out there available. I'm happy in Q&A to talk a little more detail on Smart Growth Americas and my own thoughts. I think the case studies that we come up with, though, to show you some examples, and I might go a little fast to be mindful of time, but I think one of the bigger examples that we kind of see, and we see in Aspen, you have an employee housing fund. So this is a set-aside fund for workforce housing. So now this is a city or a county using certain funds to make sure that those units are deed restricted for workforce housing and for employees of an area. There's everything from enabling smaller homes, and Durango gives us an example of tiny homes. This actually falls under liberalizing zoning, making sure that something that may have not been able to be built can now be built, and in this case is an example of that. They turn out to be rather affordable units. Again, another workforce housing example. This becomes a theme of what we see a lot of cities and counties coming up with, because it's a huge problem. If you have your teachers, your firefighters, your first responders, just simply imagine on Oahu itself, a first responder trying to make a living and working downtown or near Waikiki or in your more urbanized areas may not afford, I'm going to guess, probably doesn't necessarily easily find a unit for themselves or their family to live right there. Maybe is commuting upwards to an hour, even more. We find nationally that the number of what we call them so-called mega commuters, this is around the country, mega commuters, 2 hours plus, that share is falling very heavily on these types of individuals, especially first responders, teachers, nurses, individuals who provide critical services to the community. That's why workforce housing is really important. It's getting folks to live where they actually work and where people need them. Community housing trust, this is a model where you have trust funds established by local areas. This is county and city led. where you're working with a housing developer through a trust fund to make sure that some of these homes are then led to a certain affordability requirement, in this case, 120% AMI. And lastly, we have on this is going to get to that preservation, keeping people in their homes. There's 5 toolkits that I talk about in this area, but just to highlight them for a second for folks watching at home, and that we can think about these rapid rehousing programs, transition assistance, emergency housing assistance. I'll show you some examples, but a lot of them actually do have to get into identifying an inventory and educating individuals when this stuff's coming online, and making sure that both the tenants, the people who live in the units, are aware of that this is happening to them with enough lead time to be given support of what to do if they need relocation, and being given the tools to navigate the process as they're going through it. I think that's the bigger way of framing some of this, of what we see. So the example in Boston here is targeting, being very aware, these are the units that are expiring and you're targeting them for intervention. This is then targeting them for technical assistance, for education programs at the property level. So the property owner then knows, sometimes they may not even be fully aware of what to do when their situation is expiring, when their credits or their other subsidies are expiring. And that's where some of those advisory services led by the state, led by local communities come in. In some cases, this is the example of that type of right of first refusal. In this case, an opportunity to purchase act. This is a mandate that in this case, the District of Columbia, serving both as a city and a state, was enabled. But for units that might be going to market rate or being converted from apartment to condominiums, the tenants have some rights to be able to purchase, and they receive some education, awareness, and assistance to be able to do that. Home share programs. Now, this is a little different. This is sort of taking a twist on your short-term rental idea, but in this case, it's the idea that you can have a way where individuals can share their homes with specific populations, whether it's workforce, seniors, individuals with disabilities, to be able to have. And sometimes those are in violation. Are in violation of local zoning laws. There's a lot of local zoning laws that make it illegal for too many individuals who are not related to live in a unit. So this actually requires some careful intervention on that regard. Seniors First. So I think Seniors First in New York, it highlights again, intervening, identifying the problem, educating individuals. In this case, it's for ideas of senior housing, to be able to get ahead of the problem. Know what it is, intervene, make sure that those units are best kept at low risk rather than high risk of conversion to market or displacement for the individuals. And so I think actually that's the extent of the presentation here, but I want to stress there's a lot of tools available I'm happy to speak on, and I thank the committee for their time on this, and happy to take your questions.
Great, thank you. Why don't we go directly into the HHFDC presentation?
Oh, okay.
And then we'll
That sounds great.
after.
Okay. Awesome.
Good afternoon, chairs, Vice Chair. I'm David Oy, the Finance Manager for HHFDC. Thank you for allowing us this time today to present to you. Thank you as well, Michael. It was a pleasure speaking with him and the rest of the ARP folks as well on this topic. So I'm just here to give a brief overview on the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit LIHTC program that HHFDC is the administrator for. So the LIHTC is a federal government's primary program for developing affordable housing. It was created in 1986, provides developers and investors with tax credits. It's not direct funding, it's tax credits which they're able to monetize or sell to raise equity to fund their affordable housing projects. So the process is basically the project owner will propose their project to the state housing agency. which is HHFDC for Hawaii. And we apply and forward an award allocation of tax credits every year to the projects. HHFDC can do one application and funding round each year. On average, we've been receiving over the past 3 years approximately 30 applications from developers for affordable housing projects. Successful applicants are then awarded tax credits and other funding resources, such as the Rental Housing Revolving Fund, or HRF, and HOU-LeMay multifamily bond, private activity bonds. So going through all the process of obtaining all permits, securing all financing, and developing the project, and 9% projects have to be completed within 2 years of receiving their awards. After the completion of the project, the development costs are then certified, and then the project units are rented to low-income tenants for the specified affordability period. So the equity itself from LIHTC projects, LIHTC does not provide, again, direct funding to developers or investors. The owner will receive these tax credits, which they use to syndicate with various investors to raise capital for the project. So the project will receive, capital based on the dollar value of the credits, and the investors will give a certain amount of price based on that tax credit that infuses the equity into the projects. So the LIHTC provides funding for direct funding for the housing project. It allows the investor, which is basically the partners of the project, to take the federal tax credit, and the project owner will raise this capital and invest it directly into the project. Depending on which LIHTC program you use, you're either going to receive up to 70% of your equity or around 30% of your project's funding. So each project has a compliance period associated with LIHTC. So when you receive LIHTC funding, you are subject to a federal compliance period. So the initial compliance period, which is the first 15 years after the completion, which is when the project is placed in service, that's the initial compliance period. So that's where the affordability restrictions have to remain in place, and that's during the period when the investor begins collecting their credits for their equity they've infused. So there's also an extended period beyond that first 15 years, which is referred to federally as the extended use period. That is a total of 30 years of required affordability with LIHTC. So these projects that are LIHTC funded have to stay bound by their affordability restrictions for a minimum of 30 years. Now, Hawaii's qualified allocation plan, which is what governs our LIHTC program, we require a minimum of 45 years for our LIHTC, but we give maximum points to projects that apply for funding of 61 years. So, the preference that we lend to longer affordability periods, nearly all of the projects that apply to us for funding and are subsequently awarded commit now to a 61-year affordability period. So the projects have to undergo an annual certification to make sure that they are still meeting the renting to eligible households, and the rents are within the thresholds of HUD's AMI range. The penalty for not adhering to this is what's called a recapture of the credits. So basically the investor is going to lose the ability to collect credits. The owner is going to be accountable for that. So that is probably the worst case scenario from the owner's standpoint. So that's the restriction and the requirement that keeps the units monitored and affordable. So these are actively monitored every year. So in addition to the annual certification, there is a regulatory agreement that is recorded on the land that specifies the affordability condition, and that is what is a recordable binding of the owner to the affordability commitments. And again, the investors are subject to recapture if they fail to comply with the regulatory agreement during the 15-year compliance period. So how much LIHTC does Hawaii receive? So the 9% LIHTC, which is the competitive volume cap, it's allocated every year by the IRS to every state based on the population. So for 2024, Hawaii will be allocated approximately 3,360,000. Now, for typical years, this is typically around what Hawaii gets. For this competitive round, this will equate to probably 150 units over 2 to 3 projects. We receive probably about 7 to 8 applications annually to award those projects every year. So these are highly competitive. And again, just to clarify, the 9% will cover about 65 to 70% of a project's cost. The 4% LIHTC will cover about 30% of a project's costs. So how are LIHTCs awarded? So the LIHTC again is awarded through the Qualified Allocation Plan. It's a point-based scoring system which takes into account mandated requirements of the IRS Section 42, which governs LIHTC, and the priorities of the state. It also is meant as a tool to convey to applicants the other requirements of the program, and so that all applicants have an equal opportunity to know what our requirements are and our priorities are in awarding these funds. The QAP for Hawaii places a high priority on two areas, which are project readiness and project efficiency of funds, use of funds. Sorry about that. Well, I skipped ahead too far. Sorry about that. So the applications, once they're received, we receive them once a year. The deadline for applications this year was February 2024. So applications are received annually, and they're evaluated and scored by HHFDC's finance and development staff utilizing the QAP. The recommendations for projects that we award for LIHTC and other resources that are applied for are then presented to the board for approval. So what I want to show here is the current income and rent restrictions for a 1-bedroom unit, 2-bedroom household based on HUD's annual calculations for Hawaii. So you can kind of see where, the income AMI thresholds are. The reason we highlight 60% is because this is the area that LIHTC can fund, 60% and below. These are the set-aside requirements for the LIHTC program. So the monthly rent figures that are shown are all inclusive of living expenses, so water, gas, sewer, electricity. So this kind of reflects the downside of the LIHTC program as well, because it is restricted by the income limit of 60% AMI. So this slide shows that in the next 20 years, 2,082 units, excuse me, have expiring affordability commitments under the LIHTC program. This number is lower than what was seen in some of the other exhibits, just because the national database that is accessed by Smart Growth America for the data doesn't take into account, as Michael mentioned, the additional affordability commitments that are on projects that could be recorded in deed restrictions or other declarations of restricted covenants. So this is sort of a breakdown right now of the number of projects and the number of units that we are monitoring for expiring affordability. So for raising rents, right now, LIHTC owners can raise their rents annually during the compliance period up to the specified limit by HUD. So when HUD releases their AMIs, the landlords are able to raise their rents as long as they're still within that threshold. This has to take into account the annual increases in household income. That's how HUD calculates their income limits. So things like inflation, other items like that, that's how they raise the limits to make sure that these projects can stay affordable. After the compliance period, the rules for rent increases are governed by the Residential Landlord Tenant Code. So after the restrictions were end, there's the standard required notice by HRS for landlords to inform tenants of any sort of rent increase that they're going to implement. So LIHTC projects without restrictions typically will become naturally occurring affordable housing and rent at what we've seen is around 80% AMI. They generally become available to the public without any sort of income restrictions, but the tenants will fall generally within the 80% AMI range. The units are not gone. They just do not have the strict restricted affordability and income restrictions and rent restrictions as they would under the LIHTC program. But with this in mind, some ideas that we have to require of future LIHTC projects, We feel that notification is critical to allow tenants time to adjust and to allow owners to plan accordingly for their tenants. So one of the items we're looking at is requiring notifications to tenants of expiring extended use periods. So we're thinking sort of a 12-month notice, a 6-month notice, and then a subsequently 90-day notice, just so that they're required, these owners that receive LIHTC funding are required to provide this notice to tenants, as well as providing them education, as well as what they can do to keep the affordability on the property. We're considering a limit of 1 increase per certification period per household. And for the notification of rent increases, because the rents are able to be increased, as the HUD AMIs increase, if we require a minimum 60 days notice, specifically within the QAP for LIHTC subsidized units, for any rent increases, minimum 90-day notice of any increase in excess of 5% with existing rents, with an option possibly to terminate without penalty if it's an excessive rent increase such as that. So these are some of the ideas that we're considering. And then also explore incentives to achieve extended affordability and couple that with some sort of subsidy for the rehab. As Michael mentioned, a lot of these projects, as they get older, they have significant capital needs as well as affordability. So is there a way to couple the subsidizing the need to renovate with extending the affordability beyond that? So there are 2,000 units expiring within the next 20 years, but HHFDC's 5-year unit projection plan, so this is our projection pipeline for development, we project about 6,497 affordable units, rental units being developed within the next 5 years. About 5,700 of those are LIHTC units within the next 5 years. And units if you'll notice here, you'll see that the units in 27 and 28 will increase because projects awarded this year will deliver in 27, 28. And the high volume of new inventory can be attributed to 2 factors. Specifically support from the legislature, in providing RHRF, Rental Housing Revolving Fund. This has allowed us to really stretch and finance more 4% LIHTC projects, so we are very appreciative and thankful for that. And the other factor we attribute this to will be focused on the QAP for prioritizing readiness and efficiency. We want to make sure that our pipeline can support building the maximum number of units annually and efficiently using state funds and taxpayer funds, because we need the units as quickly as possible to address the housing crisis, which we all can agree is reaching critical mass and just gets worse year over year. That's all we have. I'm available for any questions.
Thank you. Maybe we should start with questions for Smart North America since you went first, followed by HHFDC. To our House counterparts, any questions? Vice Chair.
Thank you for the presentation.
If you could speak it to the mic.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I noticed for Maui County, you said it does not include the Lahaina fire update.
It would not include the fire update.
Okay.
We were best able to just identify the number of units that we believe are within that risk zone. I don't know the current status of those units.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I know Halemaho'olu burnt down, and there was another project that burnt down, but it's coming back online, I believe, by the end of this year. So, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
All right. If not, then I have some. Thank you again
sure.
for flying all the way down and conducting this research.
Thank you.
Do you have an idea of the historical context for why these federal programs were created to build temporarily affordable housing? Why wasn't perpetual affordability incorporated into these programs from day one?
Well, I think in our sort of the history of affordable housing. My colleagues at Smart Growth America are already laughing that I'm going here. But we started through sort of the post-war period into the 60s, 70s with the older paradigm was probably just straight public affordability, right? So you had projects, quote unquote, projects, public housing, large structures all across the country. And that was how a lot of affordability subsidized by the federal government was done. So then we've moved away from that, and these programs, just all sorts of hosts of programs where now we have LIHTC. I can't remember when the actual legislation was passed, but but it's not just LIHTC. We're talking Section 8, FHA, home, a host of, let's just call it federal housing policy, state housing policy following, that leads more away from traditional public housing projects. We saw Cabrini Green famously come down, and some of the failures that probably went with that paradigm. And I think historically there was a questioning of whether that was necessarily a good idea that led towards more of a privatization, we might say, or a mixed blended form of this. So let's think of LIHTC specifically. Okay, there's an affordability period, whether we call it 15, 30 years or so. One of the reasons that we have that is the funding streams and the way that the structure goes, especially because by and large, there are private developers involved in that process. We saw about almost half of them. There's another quarter that's nonprofit that's eligible. Okay, so we have somebody who wants to go 15, 30 years. If we get to that 30-year, 45-year, 75-year, whichever period, the risk of greater affordability mandates is in two areas. Number one, that the funding would need to follow the additional mandate. So one consideration is whether future funds from the state would be pre-obligated for a session 50 years hence. Because when we get to that point, call it 45 years or so, that unit may need major rehabilitation. Now, under the current structure, what often happens is there is a risk of loss towards market rate. That happens. In a lot of situations, there's a so-called resyndication or another financing project, or they come back for another set of funds. Those funds go into major rehabilitation of the unit, and now a new time period happens. So we observe that, and our friends at HHFDC informed us this happens a lot in Hawaii, that period does kind of continue more than what you saw on day one, 10, 30 years. So 10,000 units expiring. Of course, we would expect many of those, we hope, would resyndicate to a new level of affordability. So it's that future obligation, to be clear, that future obligation of state funding would need to be there to ensure that the program stays in a state of good repair. If that were to not happen, the other risk, and these aren't certainties, but it's a high risk, would be that that unit may have a mandate of a certain level of affordability, but the risk being that the investment in rehabilitation may not occur, and the units in the future would effectively become in a state of disrepair, dilapidated, and just simply not in proper conditions. That's that risk. And overlaying all of that risk is simply program non-participation. At a certain point, if this program and a lot of the current statutory paradigm relies on a certain level of private sector development, nonprofits as well, program non-participation can be a risk that a certain level of different tweaks here and there, there's the positive of what we might want out of policy outcomes, and there might be a negative, which is the risk of, if we have, as Dean said, let's say 8 applicants in a given year, if that were to become 2 applicants, you might reduce the competitiveness of a program, or even the competitiveness of these types of programs overall. And it might become 0, plausibly could become 0 if the mandates are too high. And that sort of depends. If requires further study to know what necessarily would happen, but by indications of what some private developers might indicate on their end. And we do have a group, I should mention, at Smart Growth America, there's a group of developers. We have Locus, that's LOCUS, that's Latin for place or center. A group of developers we speak with that are mission oriented, posing a type of question that is the type of risk. Program non-participation, future dilapidation if the funds don't follow, and on the kind of wonky statutory side, idea that if the funding were to follow for 50 years, that would imply a pre-obligation of state funding for a pretty long time period.
So, you know, just my reaction is that need for obligating future funds doesn't go away just because it's not on paper in the statute, but also that, you know, as you already identified, the risk of program non-participation, I feel like is maybe we've passed that, because we do have, as we've already heard, a lot of interest in these programs. Have any other states required perpetual affordability in any of these programs?
I'm not aware that there's states that have gone toward the level of perpetual affordability. Like Hawaii, that does exceed the federal mandate. That's so you have 15 plus 15, as Dean mentioned, and then Hawaii has some that could go towards 61. Now that's an incentive program rather than a mandate, where you're prioritized for more affordability. I think that incentive bucket, like I like to talk about incentives, disincentives, and mandates, that incentive bucket, because these programs are competitive, through that incentive of awarding additional points, can actually naturally increase and see where that level is of of increased participation and competition. That creates a little bit, and we would hope the idea there would be a race to the top. If we incentivize more on what is ultimately a competitive program with limited funds towards greater affordability requirements, that would be there. The pre-obligation issue, Senator, is that I completely would agree with you. Even if it's not statutory on paper today under existing conditions, there is kind of a notional, you sort of do know when these things come to pre-obligation, many of the to their expiration, many of these programs come back again, and then you're repeating the cycle over and over again. It's hard to account for that in a statutory way, but you might in a way that's not pre-obligated. So there's this balance of, do you pre-obligate funds, or do you just come to a soft understanding that many of these expiration programs come, and hopefully maybe even track. This is something we were unable to, in the quick wave that we did the research and under limited time, identify how many of these programs, when they reach their 15, 30-year mark or exceeding 30 years, are coming back for a re-up. And that re-up would imply federal and state funds coming with it. So this happens. How many of those are re-up? I don't know. And I think that's an incredibly interesting question to know, because if we can understand that, then we start getting a better understanding of what does the risk of expiration actually mean, and what is the level of funding necessary to keep this going. If we observe that there are units that continue for the 45, 60-year period, and we can see the typical level of funding, we have a bit of a better idea of what that long-term 80-year pipeline looks like cycle, even if it's probabilistic, even if it's not, you don't know whether that it's 100%, but you know it's a pretty big percent. I would certainly like to know that. I think that's probably a really interesting way to think about it, Senator.
So maybe we can get to that, because HHFDC may have that answer. If you want to chime in now, feel free to do so.
So the current funding round that we received applications for this year, we had a total out of the 30 applications we did receive, 4 unique projects applied for acquisition rehab funding through this round. Last year, we did award 1 acquisition rehab project. Palolo Valley Homes was awarded acquisition rehab credits and funding to rehabilitate about just under 300 units.
But what percentage of the expiring units will apply for these funds and receive them?
We haven't really seen, it depends on when they're going to be expiring. A lot of them will come in ahead of time, depending on who the owner is, if the owner is aware that their affordability is in danger, or it could be a matter of the affordability running out, or it could be a matter of the property needing significant capital improvements, or it could be both. But we don't have any research right now as to how many of the expiring projects are coming in, and at what point are they going to be, how early they're coming in to be resyndicated.
Can you put that together?
I can do that for you, Senator.
Thank you. So back to smart growth. So, you talked about the risk of program non-participation, presumably because the developers would feel inadequately compensated for the risk that they were taking in building these units with public funds. I've heard this argument before, but I think, my guess is that the net present value of a project from year 30 forward or year 61 forward, probably pretty small. Have you done any research on calculating what it would cost to preserve these units in situations like that?
Well,
to buy the year 61 forward?
I haven't done that. What I'm aware is that many of these programs are either just the operating life of a LIHTC structure is often going to involve either coming back for rehabilitation funding year 30 or something like that, which may involve resyndicating, repackaging, finding another group of investors and reselling some credits at that point in time, or in fact just considering taking that building and just taking it to market, giving up on the whole thing. That happens. I don't know the percent that happens, Senator, but on a net present value basis, a lot of the incentive on the developer is also on exit strategy, which then gets into, is their exit strategy necessarily to sell to market, or are they committed here? It depends, and project by project. I would hope and do believe that many developers who choose to engage in the LIHTC program are committed towards longer term affordability. Now, whether that's 60 and whether 60 is the cutoff, is it 70? This is that tough type of an answer, Senator, where it's, as I say a lot, it's an empirical question worth a lot of study. But between somewhere to 30 and maybe perpetual, you might start seeing a decay where non-participation starts becoming a risk. Though I do think what's very interesting on the incentive side, like we talked about, you have in Hawaii bonus points for more affordability. That actually gives you an interesting view on how developers are thinking about it, because there's a lot of uptake on that incentive side. Then it's telling you that they're willing to go into the program for that point, for that extra bonus. It's sort of an inversion of mandate of affordability. It's using incentives rather than mandate on that. I think it's interesting because you might get, like Dean had just mentioned, with a little idea of digging in where that happens. How much more do you actually get? Are you getting 40 years? Are you getting an average of 47 years? Are you getting an average of 59 years of this? What if the state were to update that type of, right now it's 61 years, maybe the bonus could go up to 99. And at a certain point, I think you get into statutory issues I'm aware in this state in terms of 99-year leases. And I think that's another specific thing I'm not aware.
So in principle, though, we heard that 61 years is the longest period for which you are awarded, additional points. In principle, what do you think of perpetuity as the longest period?
I think the net present value of any structure at any point, when you get to year 30, 40, just net present value becomes very small. That's just a mathematical fact. So I agree with you there, Senator. The thing with that net present value, though, is a lot of the times, because of the resyndication, they're not thinking about it. Today's 2022, or excuse me, 2024. They're not thinking about it in terms of 2054 terms or 64 coming back to today. It may be that when you are in 2054 with the resyndication program, they're resetting the clock at that point in time. And now they're thinking the net present value from that point in time forward. So now they're thinking of the other 40 years. So that net present value does come up when you get to that point. That's, I think, why it depends on the commitment of the individual owner, whether they're going to go down. So perpetuity. Again, it's plausible at some level that you may be able to have a perpetual program that still has some some participation in the program, that there may be enough developers who are willing to say, we will engage in a program if the terms are, let's say, effectively, call it 100 years, if not maybe effectively perpetuity, that they would participate. However, that risk that may happen, though, is even with the participation, there's going to need to be some level of funding mechanisms, whether that comes from the developer's own commitment or whether that comes from the state. Somebody has to be paying for pretty major rehabilitation come 30. That's a very big fact of just structures of capital investment, major rehabilitation coming online. Then if you might have that, you might get participation. There could be a risk of just non-repair and disrepair, or dilapidation or non-attention to some of these units. So that net present value might have come in at that front end, but now you're in that term 40, 50, and someone might be thinking about how much is it worth it to them to rehabilitate the unit in the absence of future funds. So all these issues of the risks that I talked about, I think they come into this interplay of risk of non-participation, the risk of dilapidation, and the risk of future obligation of funds. And that's where we have to think about. So to answer your question in some way, Senator, directly, it's plausible, but these risks are very important to consider.
I understand what you're saying. I think that, if we kind of zoom out a little bit, I think that these issues are a product of the limitations of decisions that were made, in 1986 with LIHTC, and even before that in 1937. In America, we can only conceive of restricting AMI like 80% or 60%, or market, which is the highest bidder. And it does not occur to Americans that there is an in-between level, which is cost basis, which is what is done in many other jurisdictions, where you can be income blind, but you don't have to charge whatever the highest bidder is willing to pay, but rather you charge whatever it takes to cover your costs. And that's the way that, European
Yes.
housing is delivered. And so we would not be in the position of renting, collecting rents that are way too low for the maintenance of the building. You could collect rents that would sustain the building indefinitely, in perpetuity.
And I'm aware, Senator, that the state and friends at HHFDC do look at, when you're looking at an application, I'm sure Dean would agree, you're looking at the overall picture of the long-term program. Just like a condo unit is technically, the board has a fiduciary duty to be collecting enough funds as you go along to pay for to pay for future expenses, keep the units going. That does happen with these as well. I heavily agree with you, Senator. I think our current housing collective regime of policy is this product over a century, half a century, especially in the later 20th century, that could use some reimagination, both at the Washington Congress, at the Congress level, and within states, to be further innovative. I think a lot of focus is on LIHTC. That's what we have. I think the incentives financially from Congress are there, and that's why it's one of the leading mechanisms with which affordable units get built in terms of formal subsidized affordable units. Section 8 and other programs a bit pale in comparison to the delivery that's happening there. So other program possibilities, there's other places where we see inclusionary zoning happening at the local state level, in other innovative financing structures that don't have to do with LIHTC. So there's sometimes tax increment financing, as I mentioned, is one mechanism, especially with large infrastructure, where a piece of that increment, large development happens, there's an increment in the tax base. Some of that increment can be obligated or skimmed, for lack of a better word, to fund affordable housing programs. That at very small micro levels has been done around the country. I can't think of the exact example, unfortunately, in my head, but I know that it has been done. Host of ways to do it, but I think we have been, most people would probably agree, not creative enough with how we do affordable housing in this. And lastly, thinking about supply side and the issues. I know that I'm aware that there's a bill in the Senate right now considering some reforms in that area in terms of supply. All of this together, the proof is that today in 2024 in America, we do have an affordability crisis. In Hawaii, in every other state, wherever I go, this happens. That's there, and that's the result of a lot of policy programs that I don't think have been maximizing their effectiveness. So we could stand, and I would very much love to work with the state of Hawaii, continue to think about more innovative solutions to get out of this existing paradigm where this is really only the one way that we think about or deliver the most units. I get why, because it's the incentives that we have from Congress and the systems that we've had. But there are other ways of thinking about it, Senator.
I agree. And, you know, I understand the different, you know, the political spectrum has a variety of views on this, but as I've learned more and more about housing over the years, I think one analogy here is to the world of education. And so you mentioned inclusionary zoning. Inclusionary zoning is like trying to fix an education problem by forcing private schools to give scholarships. Section 8 is like vouchers. They are vouchers. And LIHTC is like charter schools, except that schools that they pay for, you know, get sold to the highest bidder after 15, 30, or 61 years, or however many years. And the same reasons why my side, my political party and my side of the aisle are opposed to vouchers and charter schools are the same reasons why I believe that my side of the aisle should oppose vouchers and charter school production in housing. Because it's siphoning off money from what you said earlier, which is the original Section 9 public housing program. All of these programs are there to starve Section 9 of resources. And Section 9 itself was starved by resources starting in 1937 when it was forced to put income restrictions on everything by the private developers. It was not allowed to be income blind. It was not allowed to charge rents that would cover its own costs because private developers did not want competition for supplying the middle-class American housing market. They wanted to starve this program before it had a chance to be successful. And that's, you know, we're living with the consequences of that, of those decisions that were made all the way back in the Great Depression. And so we're trying to, I think, if we're going to reimagine housing policy, we need to reimagine it going all the way back to pre-Great Depression levels. So I think it would behoove all of us, not just in Hawaii, but nationwide, to start thinking about housing that way.
I'd agree, Senator, that Smart Growth America agrees that we stand to think about a lot of creative housing solutions in the country beyond what we currently have, leveraging what we currently have because it is, but also thinking about how things could be a little bit more effective and a lot more effective at delivering housing towards, again, I agree, not just at the lowest income, but really whoever you are, being able to find somewhere that you could live a healthy and prosperous life.
Any further questions for Smart Growth? If not, we can switch gears to HHFDC. Go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you. Your presentation was great from Smart Growth. So with the big picture, I want to go back to some of the data that you presented. And I have some ideas that may not be right or they might be wrong. So I'm going to try to understand them. Your 5-year unit projection, it looks like there's going to be over 5 years close to 10,000 units. I wanted to find out, because we started talking about you had 30 applicants and you're looking to fund 4 of those projects from 4 developers. What was the, who were you going to fund out of those 40 applicants or 30 applicants?
Well, so from last year, excuse me, thank you, Chair. So last year, every year we receive about, 30 applications. Last year, we awarded, I believe, 7 to 8 projects based on the available funding that we had for these programs. So this 5-year projection takes into account all the projects that have been previously funded and what their construction timelines are looking like. So this year, based on the available resources we have presently, we are looking to fund the same amount of projects, but we want to make sure that the projects we do fund meet those criteria of readiness and efficiency. We can't exhaust all our funds because while we do hold the awardees to a tight budget and restriction of their resources, if there is any sort of catastrophic event that would happen or some major shift in interest rates or costs that require possibly additional funding for whatever reason, we have to leave room for that as well.
So out of those 7
Mhm.
developers, are they new projects that's starting from scratch, or are they existing projects that, let's say, are going through some rehabilitation?
I don't have the exact number, but it's a mix of both. There's new construction, which is the majority of the projects in these totals here. But we do have a handful of acquisition or rehabilitation projects, but the majority are new construction across the state.
So what I was thinking when you were doing your presentation is, so this 9,658 total of unit projection, correct me if I'm wrong, they're not all new units. They're actually existing units that's already, there's somebody already housed in that unit or rent in that unit.
The total that is shown here, correct, they're not all new construction, but I would say the heavy majority do reflect new construction.
I think what
yeah.
would be helpful
Mhm.
is that these numbers reflect what are new units
Okay,
and what units are actually being rehabbed, because from this presentation,
Mhm.
I have an impression that there's going to be close to 10,000 new units coming into the market in the next 5 years. But it looks like some of these, or a small percentage, let's say a quarter of them, are actually existing units that we want to maintain as affordable housing.
certainly.
So my next part that I was thinking about is, I feel like there's a lot of ties to funding when it comes to making sure affordable housing is in the market. And if it comes down to, let's say, if with circumstances, let's say the funding is always going to stay the same. Is it true that you can only support the same amount every year with housing? For example, if you are getting a lump sum and it's the same every year, are you going to be able to only select the developers that will give you the same amount every year? Or is it truly case by case, project by project, depending on how the developer crunched the numbers and how they can squeeze that funding? Could you explain that a little bit more? Because I want to understand that.
Oh, certainly. No, thank you, Chair. So, the way our scoring and our evaluation works is we evaluate every funding program. So if they apply because they need LIHTC, they need rental housing revolving funding, they need bonds. So we score each one in its own category and we aggregate those scores and we rank all of them. Again, readiness is a measure we use, but also efficiency of funds. So how many units are you creating per dollar of each program? So how many units of RHRF are you getting, per the amount that you're using? So just the efficiency at every level, as well as the total development cost, not just including land, but also vertical construction costs. Are you being efficient? Are you an outlier in terms of how much your project is costing? We look at how much developer fee you're taking as a percentage of your project. Are you really doing this, how much are you getting out of this? We look at all of those areas when we're scoring to make sure that we are efficiently using the funds. So it's not always we would hope that with the limited amount of resources we do have. So the first part of your question, yes, we generally will get almost the same amount of HUD adjusted because the federal government determines how much we get. Generally remains the same because they consider us a small state. But we would hope that with the knowledge of those restrictions being there, that it drives competition and drives the developers. And our goal is to make them sharpen their pencils from the very beginning to know what they need to provide us to be competitive. We don't have a minimum number of units we're going to award every year. We want to award the most efficient. So it's not going to be the same people. It's not going to be the same number of units. We would hope to have more every year because we would hope the quality of application and the efficiency improves. But we do that in the same area that you have increased development costs, inflation, rising interest rates. But we take that as everybody's doing this, everybody's experiencing the same challenges. What are you doing, whoever's bringing us the application, to take this environment that we're all playing in and give us something that's going to give the state of Hawaii the most for its money?
So if efficiency is the main goal
Mhm.
in looking at units per award
Mhm.
amount, do you have an average of how much a unit per award actually would come out to?
Well, I can get you the actual breakdown for each funding source over the past 3 years. I don't have that with me right now, but we have seen an increase in the total development costs, which is not per award, just the cost of building an affordable housing unit. That we try to keep that down, and it's been staying about industry average across the country for what the total development cost is. But I can break that down for you and show you what the amount per funding source would
So
be.
I think what would be helpful in the long run is if efficiency per unit on your award,
Mhm.
I think being able to collect that data
Mhm.
and understanding what is the average per year.
Mhm.
So then you can understand going forward every year for the next 5 years that you're actually awarding efficiently.
Yes.
And you have data that you collected
Mhm.
and reported back. Because at this moment, I know your scoring is very comprehensive and your expertise is greatly needed in that field. But we don't understand if you're meeting the goals.
Oh, of course.
And as we all assume in the state that we need more
Mhm.
units, we want to just be able to say that your department is doing their top, their
Certainly.
best.
Certainly.
And this is the data that shows that they are.
Certainly. We'd be happy to provide that. And, I do know that the average per award, the average cost per unit for each of the funding sources has remained flat for at least the 3 years that I've been involved with this program, if not going down in certain years. So I agree that that's a metric that we can provide to the legislature, to the committees, to show that. I thank you very much for that.
Thank you. We'll share that information when we get it with all the committee members. Now, I understand that there's this emphasis on efficiency and readiness. You've stated that many times. But what we heard today was a presentation on this ticking time bomb,
Mhm.
where there are thousands of families who could have been living in their homes for as long as 61 years will not be able to afford rent increases if and when those affordability periods expire. And in your slide, on slide 17, about possible future initiatives, you talk about things like, early 12 months notification. If I've been living in a unit for 61 years, whether I get notification 12 months in advance or 12 days in advance, to leave my unit is a devastating trauma. It is the only home that I've probably had for my entire adult life. And speaking of AARP, I think we can probably agree that we don't want to be evicting senior citizens on fixed incomes into a housing market that has fallen absurdly, dramatically short of affordable housing. The reality is most of these people have nowhere to go. So let me ask you again, what is your plan at HHFDC to ensure that this ticking time bomb doesn't, that we don't continue to build these ticking time bombs?
And I think that, in addition to the extended affordability, one of the things we want to look at is for the inventory that's a plan for new LIHTC projects, these initiatives that we showed here, so the future possibility. One of the things that conceptually I think we need to look at that I touched on earlier was for projects that are currently approaching this end of affordability, is there a way to provide the two things that we are needed most? Extended the affordability so that nobody gets displaced, but also, as been brought up by Smart Growth America, making sure that the capital improvements that are necessary to provide, maintain the quality of life for these residents is maintained. So I think HHFDC would need to work to find ways to incentivize, assisting these projects in becoming, maintaining their livability, but also extending the affordability in return for that. Because if the project theoretically was 61 years without any sort of capital improvements, I'm sure there would be a significant need for that at that point as well.
How much will that cost?
We would have to do a study, I think, with owners to survey them to see what's needed. Right now, when we do acquisition rehab projects that come in to apply, they have to do a capital needs assessment. They have to get a third-party capital needs assessment provided to us to tell us what the actual need is and what things are actually needed. I'm sure construction industry standards can tell you what things would expire, what within 5, 10, 20 years, the general items that would need to be upgraded or rehabbed at those given thresholds. And from that, we could back into possibly an amount that would be needed each of those times that could be provided in a reasonable number to extend the affordability.
So one thing that you didn't bring up that I'm surprised you didn't, because your agency brings it up all the time and has brought it up all the time, is prioritizing projects on government-owned lands. And as you know, government-owned lands, governments have no incentive to raise rents to market and reap a windfall profit from the sale or raising to market rents of these units. Are you, as you know, the QAP is up for revision again this year. After rejecting these amendments last year, are you looking at further emphasizing perpetual affordability and or government-owned lands as priorities for the QAP?
So we did, did look at another point for government-owned and county-owned lands into the QAP.
How many points?
One additional point.
Out of how many?
Out of, I believe it was a max, it's one additional point in the criteria of 6. So
out of how many altogether?
120.
1 point out of 120 points.
Well, I do want to point out that the government-owned, state-owned projects on state and county land, the ones that have applied have all received their funding and been awarded. We have never rejected a project on state and county land for funding. It was awarded when the project did show the readiness that was required, so that we didn't forego those funds in a given year. It was awarded to a project that was most ready and could begin construction or close. And then when that next state or county project came up again for application, they would be more ready to close at that time too. So we have never rejected a state or county land owned project. I do want to acknowledge the chair's point that yes, these projects that are on state and county lands that we own the fee interest, they are not at risk, conceptually, of losing their affordability, because that's not, of course, the mission of any state or government agency to endanger the affordability of these projects. However, when we are providing them, we feel that, again, with the efficiency standard that we have, we want to award the most ready projects. So we don't want to tie up funds that can be used for even 2 or 3 smaller projects that are ready to be built and deliver units sooner than it would be to commit funds to a project that's not going to be ready for 3 or 4 years, of which we can't use those, which pushes the pipeline out further. But we do recognize the feasibility benefits of state and county land to be used for affordable housing.
is it your position on the record that you have no intention of further prioritizing either perpetual affordability or state and county lands in future QOP revisions, including the one this year?
No, not at all. We are
Can you
exploring
state
that.
your position to the committees?
So we will be exploring that possibility again. We will be doing different research into what it would take. We have a permitted interaction group that has been formed. The chair has been advised. And that is on our list of items to look at and that we will bring up to the permitted interaction group to see what the position would be on that, as well as perpetual affordability. We have been tasked with doing research into the pros and cons, the other HFAs that possibly may be using perpetual affordability, to what the applicability would be for the state of Hawaii. So we are not taking that possibility off the table. We are not in any way disregarding that. It is both initiatives are being reviewed and looked at for the current year and possibly any year after that, because it is a fluid situation. Housing, the needs, the tools that come up, you know, all the brightest ideas are not always going to be in the room. So we are constantly looking at other areas, other states, other agencies such as Smart Growth Without Experience with what other people are doing to address these issues.
Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate your open-mindedness on that, because
Absolutely.
we are sitting on a ticking time bomb. Unfortunately, we're out of time today, but I want to reiterate that this is a serious problem for which there's no apparent solution other than coming to the legislature and asking for more money, which, as you know, is always an uphill battle. But in addition to the other questions that we've already asked you and for which you can provide written responses, if you can also provide responses as to why 61 years and not any other number is the current maximum length for affordability on the QAP. What percentage of the units that have ever been built have a 15, 30, 61 or other length duration of affordability? How many housing units have already expired their affordability? How many projects have been bought back by HHFDC over the years, and at what cost to taxpayers? Those would all be very helpful.
Thank you, Chair. We will work on that for you and we'll provide our written responses.
Thank you. All right, any further questions? Okay, if not, thank you very much for your time today, gentlemen.
Thank you,
Hearing is
Senator.
adjourned.
Thank you, Chairs.